Hello, it's Gregory Eaton here. I wanted to talk to you about another pair, actually, of Easter hymns, one in the Episcopal Hymnal 1982 and one not in the Hymnal 1982. We are almost at the fourth Sunday of Easter as I record this, but I want to look back to Easter itself, or our commemoration of the resurrection. And I want to bring to your mind the fact that in ancient times there was a lot more made about the role of the three Marys. Mary of Bethany, who was sister of Lazarus and Martha. Mary of Magdala, who of course was forgiven her sins by Jesus, came to love him and became one of his disciples. And the primary Mary, Mother of God, Mother of Jesus. And the accounts are universal. This is one thing that the four Gospels agree on absolutely, is that the first appearance of Jesus Christ was to these women. Whether it was two of them or three of them, there's a little disagreement on that. But first appearance of Jesus after the resurrection was to these women. And they had to go and convince the men who were cowering in fear of retribution from the crowds for having followed Jesus. It was their job to go convince the men that Jesus had risen from the dead as he had predicted and promised. So in the Episcopal Hymnal at number 190 is a hymn, "Lift Your Voice, Rejoicing Mary." And this is based on an old Latin text. So old that we're not sure exactly when it was first written. There are manuscript copies that go back to the 9th century, but it could be much older than that. Because you remember, people didn't always have printed books. They would pass things on by word of mouth and memory. So this was translated in the 19th century by Elizabeth Rundell Charles. And again, speaking of the role of women in the life of faith and the church, I want to call to mind that a number of our hymn texts were made available to us by the women who translated old Latin hymn texts into usable forms for singing in English. Catherine Winkworth is the most prolific of those. And if you look at the bottom of hymns as you go through the hymnal, you will find that Catherine Winkworth's name is at the bottom of a lot of the hymns that you know very well. Elizabeth Rundell Charles was another, a poet herself and Latin translator. And she translated this text from the Latin. Again, this is number 190 in the hymnal if you happen to have a copy of the book. And here's what the text says. "Lift your voice, rejoicing Mary, Christ has risen from the tomb. On the cross a suffering victim, now as victor he is come. Whom your tears in death were mourning, welcome with your smiles returning, let your alleluias rise. Raise your weary eyelids, Mary, see him living evermore. See his countenance how gracious, see the wounds for you he bore. All the glory of the morning pales before these wounds redeeming, let your alleluias rise. Life is yours forever, Mary, for your light is come once more, and the strength of death is broken. Now your songs of joy outpour. Ended now the night of sorrow, love has brought the blessed morrow, let your alleluias rise." It's a wonderful text. And as I say, this commemoration of the role of the Marys in Holy Week and Easter events used to be much stronger in the tradition of the Church. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of places in the liturgy where we're called to remember this story. So you may not have ever sung this hymn. The tune is by Thomas Foster, who was for many years organist of All Saints in Beverly Hills. And the tune name is Fisk of Gloucester, and that refers to Charles Fisk of Gloucester, Massachusetts, who was an organ builder. So I'm going to play the tune through once, and then sing all three verses. And if you have a hymnal, please go ahead and sing with me. And I want you to notice how gentle this tune is. It's not the sort of trumpets and timpani type of Easter. This is more reminiscent of the early morning in the garden, the soft light, Mary Magdalene thinking that the person she saw was a gardener and then realizing it's Jesus. And so this refers to any of the Marys, this text. And so I'll play through the melody as I say once and then sing all three verses. And if you can join me, please do. Remember, this organ has an external blower, so you're going to hear noise when I turn it on. So that is a hymn in the hymnal that you may not have heard before. It wouldn't surprise me if you had never heard it before. And as I say, for many, many decades, even centuries, the role of the women in the Easter and resurrection stories was sort of underplayed, especially in Protestant churches. And it was the reason that there's a 20th century tune on this text is that there's no tradition of singing these texts to in modern time, so it needed a new tune. There was no tune existing. Another tradition, especially in the Orthodox Church, is of what's known the tradition of the Myrrhophores, or the myrrh bearers, and that refers to Mary of Bethany, again, sister of Lazarus and Martha, who anointed Jesus when he was visiting their house. And you may remember the disciples objected that this costly ointment could have been, the money could have been used for the poor. And Jesus told them they didn't understand, because really she was anointing him for his death. That story is best told in John 12. In Matthew 26, where it appears also, it is a little unclear who's doing the anointing. It just says a woman, and it even refers to as being in a different house. But the tradition is that it's Mary of Bethany. And then what's interesting about that story is, again, it's about resurrection, because he was in their house following the raising of Lazarus. And you need to remember that right after that, the chief priests are talking about putting Lazarus to death, because his resurrection is making people follow Jesus instead of following their rules. And so even at this stage, the temple authorities, the chief priests, would rather put someone to death than to have the redemption of the resurrection come to be known. So this is all a prefiguring of the Holy Week and Easter story. Then, of course, there is Mary of Magdala, who, as I say, was forgiven by Jesus of her sins, came to follow him, and became one of his disciples. And then, of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus, who had to watch her son die on Calvary. And I think it's only just, don't you, that she would be first to know that he had risen. And so the British author Ray Whitney, who, let's see, she was born in 1927, wrote this text in 1981. It did not make it into the hymnal 1982, mostly because the text selection process was already mostly finished by 1981. But it's a marvelous text. And I'm going to read the text for you before I sing this hymn version. Listen to this. Myrrh-bearing Mary from Magdala came, seeking her Jesus with spirit aflame. He had commanded her sickness depart. She now would thank him for newness of heart. Myrrh-bearing Mary to Bethany came, seeking her Jesus who'd called her by name. There she anointed his feet and his head with precious oils that were meant for the dead. Myrrh-bearing Mary to Calvary came, seeking her Jesus who hung there in shame. And as the careless and heedless passed by, hopeless and helpless, she watched her Lord die. Myrrh-bearing Mary to death's garden came, seeking her Jesus who'd borne the world's blame. Heartsick she stood till she heard the Lord's voice. Mary, he said, I am risen, rejoice. Isn't that a wonderful text? It chokes me up, so forgive me if I'm a little emotional there. I think it really strikes home, and I think it's marvelous to bring to mind this tradition of the role of the women in Holy Week and Easter and in the ministry of Jesus. So David Hurd wrote a tune for this, which he called Myrrhophores, after the Orthodox word for these three Marys, the myrrh bearers. And the first time it was sung by a student at the General Theological Seminary, and as a solo. And she came to rehearse it with David. And David had played me this tune and the text, and I found them both moving. And he started to play, and she said, "Oh, could we slow it down?" And this is one case where maybe the singer has an idea that is better than the composer's. And when Mitzi sang this at the slower tempo and with her wonderfully expressive interpretation, it grabbed both of us anew. So I hope that it will do the same for you. I don't know how well you can hear me over the roar of the blower and the sound of the organ, but I'm going to try singing this David Hurd tune for you. And believe me, singing and playing harmonies of David Hurd isn't the easiest thing in the world, so if I make a mistake, please forgive me. But here we are, Myrrh-Bearing Mary, with text by Ray Whitney, and the tune Miraphors by David Hurd. I'm going to stop the clocks, or else they will make noise during the hymn. Yep. So, that is a look at an ancient tradition of the Church, the commemoration of the Marys, Mary of Bethany, Mary of Magdala, and Mary the Mother of Jesus, all of whom played pivotal roles in Jesus' ministry, in the events of Holy Week, and in Easter. I'm sorry that we don't have more hymns in our hymnal about them, but maybe that's a challenge out there for the poets among us to write more texts, like Ray Whitney's wonderful text, for the musicians like Tom Foster and David Hurd to write new tunes, It is always important to remember the familiar songs, the ones that we're comfortable with, but it's also important to expand our faith and sort of exercise it by doing new things. So I hope you found this interesting. I wish you all a blessed fourth Sunday of Easter, or whatever time you are listening to this in, and I look forward to our being able to see each other at some time in the future. Bye-bye.